Do you believe people can really change? Or do they just get better at hiding things?
You know that moment when your whole world narrows down to one fragile heartbeat, and the people who should be your rock just vanish into thin air, leaving you to hold everything together with spit and sheer willpower. That's exactly where my nightmare began, in the sterile confines of a hospital waiting room in Omaha, Nebraska, where the relentless hum of fluorescent lights and distant beeps from monitors amplified every anxious thought racing through my mind as I watched my 15-year-old son Alex being wheeled away for open-heart surgery to repair the congenital valve defect that had plagued him since birth. A procedure the doctors had delayed as long as possible but could no longer ignore because the risks of clots or sudden failure were mounting with each passing month. And I had poured every spare moment and dollar from my job as an insurance claims adjuster into preparing for this day, coordinating with specialists, navigating the labyrinth of insurance approvals, and steeling myself against the fear that one wrong turn could steal the light from my boy's eyes forever. Yet, despite all that preparation and the emotional weight pressing down on my chest like an invisible anvil, not a single member of my so-called family bothered to appear. Not my mother Evelyn, with her promises of unwavering support from her sun-soaked Florida condo. Not my brother Mark, who always talked a big game about family loyalty from his chaotic real estate office in Chicago, and certainly not my sister Lisa, the perpetual dreamer flitting through life in Denver, who had texted enthusiastic emojis about showing up with homemade treats to brighten the waiting room. Because apparently their lives were filled with excuses far more pressing than witnessing the most terrifying ordeal of my existence as a single mother who'd already weathered a bitter divorce and years of solo parenting without a safety net to catch us if we fell. In the weeks leading up to that fateful surgery, I had reached out to them with a clarity born of desperation, detailing the exact date and time of the procedure at the regional medical center, providing flight information from major hubs, suggesting affordable hotels within walking distance of the hospital so they wouldn't have to navigate the sprawling parking lots or rush-hour traffic on I-80, and even offering to cover a portion of their travel costs from the emergency fund I'd scrimped together precisely for moments when family might actually step up. Because deep down I clung to the outdated notion that blood ties meant something unbreakable. That after Dad's death a decade earlier, which left me handling the funeral arrangements and settling his mounting medical debts while they scattered to their respective corners of the country, this crisis would finally draw them back into the fold as the supportive relatives I had always imagined they could be, with Evelyn's voice on the phone dripping with maternal concern as she assured me she'd clear her calendar and be there to hold Alex's hand through the pre-op jitters, Mark's gruff acknowledgement that he'd shuffle his client meetings and make the drive himself despite the distance, and Lisa's flurry of messages promising distractions like board games and her famous chocolate chip cookies to ease the tension during those interminable hours of waiting, all of which painted a picture of unity that temporarily masked the history of letdowns stretching back to my childhood in our modest family home on the outskirts of the city, where I was the one who stayed behind to care for Dad during his decline while they pursued ambitions that often left me holding the emotional and financial bags alone. As the day unfolded with that crisp autumn bite in the air filtering through the hospital's automatic doors, I gripped Alex's hand tightly in the pre-op area, his palm sweaty against mine as nurses bustled around attaching 4 lines and explaining the anesthesia process in calm, practiced tones. That did little to quell the storm inside him or me, and I leaned close to whisper assurances about the adventures we'd embark on once he recovered. Visions of weekend hikes in the Platte River valleys or late-night sessions playing his favorite video games on the console we'd saved for as a post-surgery reward. Fighting back the tears that threatened to betray my resolve, because in that moment I had to be the unbreakable force he needed, the mother who projected certainty even as my heart hammered with the what-ifs of surgical complications or post-op infections that the doctors had outlined in exhaustive detail during our consultations. When they finally rolled him away down that echoing corridor, the doors swinging shut behind the team with a finality that sucked the air from my lungs, I stumbled into the waiting area, a cavernous space filled with other families clustered in tight knots of shared worry, their murmurs blending into a white noise that isolated me further as I claimed a worn vinyl chair, and scanned the entrances every few minutes for any sign of arrival, but the hours dragged on with only sporadic updates from the circulating nurse about the incision progress and the careful navigation around Alex's delicate arteries. Each report a fragile thread of hope amid the growing void left by the empty seats beside me, and by the time evening shadows lengthened across the linoleum floors, the reality settled in like a lead weight, my phone remaining stubbornly silent. Save for automated reminders about follow-up appointments and junk emails hawking miracle cures that mocked my vulnerability. Finally, after what felt like an eternity compressed into a single breath-held vigil, the surgeon emerged with scrubs still bearing the faint scent of antiseptic, his expression one of measured relief as he described the successful repair and Alex's transition to recovery, details about the valve graft holding steady and vital signs stabilizing that washed over me in a wave of exhausted gratitude, allowing me to slip into the post-op room where my son lay pale and groggy under the beeping monitors, his small frame dwarfed by the tangle of tubes and wires that tethered him to life. And as I settled into the stiff armchair beside his bed, stroking his hair until his eyelids fluttered in shallow sleep, the sting of abandonment sharpened into something raw and unforgiving, prompting me to fire off a group message demanding explanations for their absence, only to receive a cascade of half-baked replies that rang hollow even in text form, Evelyn blaming an unforeseen flight cancellation due to weather patterns she couldn't predict, Mark citing a last-minute deal closing that demanded his presence in the office, and Lisa attributing it to an urgent project deadline at her graphic design firm that had ballooned unexpectedly, each excuse layering onto the resentment I'd buried for years of similar slights, from missed graduations to ignored holidays, all excused away with the same flimsy justifications that positioned their convenience above any genuine commitment. That night blurred into a haze of dozing fits and vital checks, the hospital's night shift rhythm becoming my reluctant companion as I pondered the imbalance of it all, how I'd been the steady provider through their crises, wiring funds for Mark's business recoveries after risky ventures soured, covering Lisa's impulsive relocations with deposits on apartments she abandoned months later, and even supplementing Evelyn's retirement with transfers for supposed necessities that often funded indulgences like weekend getaways or home renovations, always met with effusive thanks that evaporated when reciprocity was required, leaving me to question the very foundation of our relationships in the quiet hours when exhaustion stripped away illusions. 3 days later, with Alex discharged and nestled on our living room couch in our modest rental house where the Nebraska plains stretched endlessly beyond the windows, his recovery marked by tentative smiles over bowls of simple soup and reruns of his beloved sci-fi shows, my phone vibrated with an incoming message from Evelyn that shattered the fragile calm I'd been nurturing. Her words appearing on the screen with a casual indifference that belied the audacity, requesting $10,000 to help cover the expenses for Lisa's upcoming wedding described as the event of a lifetime in some picturesque Denver venue, suggesting wire transfers or digital payments as convenient options and signing off with a perfunctory love mom, as if the plea for such a sum followed naturally from their collective absence during my son's brush with mortality, igniting a fury so visceral it propelled me to my feet in the kitchen, hands trembling as I opened the banking app and initiated a transfer of precisely $1, attaching a memo that read by some shame in stark letters, hitting confirm with a surge of defiant satisfaction that momentarily eclipsed the hurt, believing that pointed response would finally underscore the boundaries they'd trampled for far too long. But within hours my notifications erupted with alerts from the bank detailing multiple failed withdrawal attempts on dormant accounts linked to family histories, access denied from locations matching their residences and patterns suggesting deliberate incursions rather than random cyber threats, unraveling the thin veil over a deeper deception where the wedding served not as celebration, but as catalyst for a scheme that threatened to ensnare everything I'd built for Alex and me, pulling me inexorably toward a confrontation laced with revelations that would test the limits of loyalty, betrayal, and the sharp-edged justice I was only beginning to wield. That $1 transfer lingered in my mind like the aftertaste of a bitter coffee you forced down to kickstart a long day, A small act of rebellion that carried the weight of all the unspoken frustrations I'd accumulated over years of being the family's unspoken safety valve, the one who absorbed the shocks without complaint while Evelyn, Mark, and Lisa pursued their individual orbits around desires that rarely intersected with reality's demands. And as I sat there in the quiet of our living room with Alex dozing peacefully on the couch, his breathing even and unlabored for the first time in months thanks to the successful surgery that had repaired the faulty valve threatening his future, I allowed a wry smile to creep across my face, imagining their reactions to the notification popping up on their screens, Evelyn perhaps sputtering in her Florida kitchen over morning toast, Mark pausing mid-pitch in a Chicago boardroom with that salesman grin faltering, and Lisa scrolling through her phone in Denver amid bridal magazines that now seemed tainted by the audacity of her silence during our crisis. Because sending by some shame wasn't merely petty retaliation, but a distilled essence of the truth they'd evaded since our shared childhood in that drafty house on the Nebraska plains, where I learned early on to patch the holes in our family's fabric, covering for Mark's teenage scrapes with neighborhood kids by dipping into my babysitting earnings, smoothing over Lisa's dramatic school absences with notes forged in my careful handwriting, and even consoling Evelyn after Dad's long work shifts left her frazzled. All while they took those gestures for granted as if my reliability was a given rather than a choice born of love twisted into obligation. The immediate backlash arrived swiftly, Evelyn's call piercing the afternoon calm with her voice pitched in that familiar mix of indignation and manipulation, demanding to know what kind of daughter responded to a mother's plea with such cruelty, especially after Lisa's wedding was meant to unite us all in joy following the hardships we'd endured. Her words laced with reminders of past generosities like the time I'd helped fund her condo down payment after Dad's estate settled unevenly, conveniently omitting how those contributions came from my overtime hours at the insurance firm where I processed claims for families just like ours, navigating the red tape of deductibles and copays that mirrored the very surgery costs I'd shouldered alone this time around, while Mark followed up with a text chain heavy on emojis of broken hearts and family crests, urging me to reconsider for the sake of blood bonds that supposedly transcended financial squabbles. His message hinting at the wedding scale with mentions of 100 guests and custom catering that screamed excess in an economy where middle-class folks like me stretched every paycheck to cover rising utilities and Alex's follow-up meds. Lisa remained conspicuously quiet at first, her absence in the fray almost more telling than direct confrontation, until a late-evening voicemail from her broke through, her tone wavering between hurt and accusation as she described the venue's non-refundable deposits and the dream dress hanging in her closet, pleading that my dollar was a public embarrassment rippling through the family chat where cousins and aunts were already whispering about tensions, but I let each plea roll into voicemail, focusing instead on the simple rituals of Alex's recovery, like adjusting his pillows for comfort or reheating leftovers from neighbors who dropped off casseroles in a show of community support that far outshone my relatives' efforts, finding a dark humor in the contrast between their dramatic entreaties and the genuine quiet help from folks I'd barely spoken to, chuckling inwardly at how my family treated obligations like optional side quests in one of Alex's video games, popping up only when power UPS were needed to level up their own lives. Yet that fleeting sense of empowerment shattered when my banking app began its insistent barrage of alerts, starting with a login attempt flagged from an unfamiliar device geolocated to Evelyn's coastal zip code, followed by a declined transfer request pulling from an old joint account I'd established years ago to pool resources for Dad's care before his passing. The amounts modest at first, like $500 disguised as routine maintenance fees, but escalating in frequency as if testing the barriers I'd reinforced after my ex-husband's financial betrayals taught me the hard way about vulnerabilities in shared systems. Scrolling through the activity log on my laptop later that evening, the kitchen light casting long shadows across the table cluttered with Alex's homework and medical paperwork, I pieced together the implications with a growing knot in my stomach, recognizing patterns that echoed past incidents like the unexplained dips in my savings after Mark's business ventures imploded or Lisa's sudden moves to new cities, excuses always forthcoming about forgotten authorizations or clerical errors that I'd accepted to preserve peace, but now in the stark clarity post-surgery. Those lapses screamed of deliberate overreach, a family dynamic where I served as the unwitting reservoir for their impulses, whether Evelyn's sporadic splurges on cruise line specials advertised in her AARP magazine or Mark's high-stakes real estate. Gambles that promised riches, but delivered only IOUs. The light vulgarity of their entitlement struck me then, treating my hard-earned stability like a communal ATM they could raid without consequence. A realization that fueled a deeper investigation as I delved into archive statements and transaction histories, uncovering links to accounts I'd long considered dormant, but which bore traces of activity tied to wedding-related vendors. Floral orders and photography deposits that didn't align with Lisa's described budget, hinting at a coordinated effort where the matrimonial event masked broader financial maneuvers, perhaps involving Mark's questionable contacts in the property world. As the alerts continued their rhythmic pings into the night, each failure a small victory against their intrusions, I wrestled with the uncertainty blooming in my chest. The constant undercurrent of conflict urging me toward confrontation while a protective instinct whispered to shield Alex from the fallout. His innocent questions about holiday plans with grandparents adding layers of dilemma that made my choices feel heavier than the medical bills still trickling in, and in a bid for witty recourse beyond the initial dollar, I adjusted the account settings to route any further attempts through enhanced verification loops that would bog them down in endless prompts, savoring the imagined frustration from afar like a secret ally in their unraveling schemes. But just as I was cross-referencing an email chain from our old family cloud storage revealing vague discussions of shared assets for the big event, my phone illuminated with a new notification, this one detailing an access grant to a linked credit line I hadn't monitored closely. A subtle breach that connected directly to Mark's known devices and left me staring at the screen in the dim glow, heart racing with the dawning horror that their wedding desperation was merely the visible tip of a submerged iceberg of deceptions, threatening to capsize the fragile life I'd rebuilt for my son and me, propelling me toward revelations that would demand a reckoning far sharper than any text message could deliver. Delving deeper into that unauthorized access on the linked credit line felt like peeling back layers of an onion that had been rotting in the family pantry for years. Each revelation bringing tears not from sentiment, but from the acrid sting of betrayal as I hunched over my laptop in the quiet hours after Alex had retreated to his room for another round of prescribed rest. The soft glow of the screen illuminating stacks of unpaid bills and medical forms that cluttered our kitchen table like remnants of a battlefield I was still navigating. And what started as a simple review of the transaction log quickly unraveled into a tapestry of connections tying Mark's digital fingerprints to charges at upscale Chicago tailors and Denver event planners. Amounts that aligned suspiciously with wedding extras like custom invitations and rehearsal dinner venues, suggesting he wasn't just a bystander in this financial frenzy, but an active architect using his real estate savvy to mask diversions. From shared resources we'd inherited piecemeal from Dad's modest estate, resources I'd always viewed as a safety net for emergencies like Alex's surgery rather than fodder for matrimonial extravagances that benefited no one beyond their egos. The pressure from their side intensified almost immediately, Evelyn's voicemails evolving from wheedling pleas to thinly veiled accusations about my lack of sisterly spirit. Her voice cracking with feigned frailty as she described the wedding as a beacon of hope after our family's string of losses, including Dad's passing and my divorce that she claimed had hardened me into someone unrecognizable. While Mark escalated with direct texts proposing a private loan shark-free arrangement where he'd co-sign future deals to guarantee repayment, his pitches laced with that oily confidence honed from years of flipping properties that more often than not left investors holding empty lots, and Lisa finally engaged more forcefully through a series of late-night messages that oscillated between vulnerability and venom, sharing photos of gown fittings and floral mock-ups to evoke guilt while implying my dollar stunt had poisoned the well with extended family members now questioning contributions. her words painting me as the outlier in a narrative of collective joy that conveniently erased their absence from the hospital waiting room where I'd sat alone envisioning worst-case scenarios for Alex's fragile heart. In response, I adopted a strategy of calculated silence, withholding the damning details I'd uncovered to let their impatience fester like an untreated wound. Finding a wry amusement in the escalating desperation evident in their increasingly frequent check-ins that bordered on harassment. Humor arising from the irony of them treating me like a reluctant bridesmaid in their drama when I'd been the sole attendant at life's real turning points, and the light vulgarity of their presumptions had me muttering to myself about how they viewed family ties as a one-way street paved with my wallet, a dynamic that prompted my next move of clever restraint by responding only with vague acknowledgments that kept doors cracked just enough to lure more slips without committing to aid. That approach paid off sooner than expected when a thick envelope arrived in the mail a few days later, postmarked from Denver and bearing Lisa's return address, containing an embossed wedding invitation that promised an unforgettable celebration amid the Rocky Mountain vistas complete with live bands and gourmet spreads. But as I scrutinized the details under the living room lamp while Alex tinkered with his model spaceship nearby, inconsistencies jumped out like red flags at a bullfight. The date conflicting slightly with earlier mentions in her texts, and the guest list including names of distant cousins who'd long since cut ties after Dad's uneven will distribution, plus a RSVP card that urged prompt remittances for plated meals at an inflated per head rate, suggesting the event was less a union of love and more a thinly disguised fundraiser to offset mounting costs. The twist deepened my unease, stirring dilemmas about whether to confront the discrepancies head-on or continue the shadow play, especially as Alex glanced over with curiosity about the fancy paper, and I deflected with a joke about it being junk mail from a timeshare scam, unwilling to taint his recovering world with the undercurrents of adult greed that had already cost us so much in emotional currency. Yet the growing conflict gnawed at me during mundane tasks like folding laundry or prepping Alex's low-sodium meals per the doctor's orders, building an atmosphere of perpetual uncertainty where every ping from my phone could herald another intrusion or revelation, and in a bid for satisfying reciprocity, I anonymously tipped off our cousin Rita, the one relative who'd maintained a neutral stance through the years and lived just outside Omaha, forwarding her a redacted screenshot of the invite's oddities via a burner email account, watching from my end as her probing questions lit up the family group chat with demands for transparency on budgets and sources, sowing seeds of doubt that had Evelyn firing back defensive clarifications about vendor deals gone awry and Mark chiming in with assurances of legitimacy backed by his business acumen. Rita's involvement added a layer of alliance I hadn't anticipated, her follow-up call expressing solidarity born from similar past slights, like the time they'd overlooked her own child's baptism for a golf outing. And together we pieced more clues from shared memories, like Evelyn's habit of inflating events to extract sympathy dollars. But the real escalation came that evening as I was reconciling the latest bank statement showing yet another failed probe, this time from Lisa's IP range. Attempting to link her bridal registry to my profiles, my phone on speaker while I cooked dinner suddenly captured a incoming call I'd intended to ignore, Evelyn's voice bursting through in a heated exchange with Mark audible in the background, their words tumbling out in frustration over needing to accelerate pulls from the old lines before Sarah figures the full extent and freezes everything for good, Lisa interjecting sharply about the venue's hold on deposits tying up their escape routes. The conversation laced with references to offshore accounts and bounce checks that confirmed the wedding as a elaborate front for laundering deeper debts, leaving me rooted to the spot with the spoon midway to the pot, the partial recording I'd managed to snag burning in my pocket like contraband. Heart thundering with the implications of their coordinated betrayal and the impending storm of revenge that now felt not just justified but inevitable, as the call cut off abruptly with Evelyn's warning hiss to lay low until they could regroup, plunging me into a cliffhanger of moral quandaries about how much further to pursue before the fallout engulfed innocence or worse, exposed Alex to the vipers I'd called family. The fragments of that overheard conversation replayed in my mind like a glitchy recording that refused to fade, each snippet amplifying the undercurrents of deceit I'd only begun to suspect as I methodically sifted through dusty boxes stored in the garage of our rental home. The air thick with the musty scent of forgotten years amid shelves lined with holiday decorations and Alex's outgrown toys that served as tangible reminders of the simpler life we'd built despite the odds and pulling out. Faded photo albums and shoeboxes of correspondence, I traced the evolution of our family's fractures from innocent snapshots of summer barbecues in the Nebraska backyard where Dad grilled burgers and we kids chased fireflies, to later images capturing Evelyn's widening smile at casinos during so-called girls' trips that coincided with her unexplained financial tight spots, pictures where her eyes held a feverish glint absent in earlier family portraits, while tucked between yellowed letters. From Mark promising big breaks in his early real estate hustles were bank statements photocopied hastily showing withdrawals I'd fronted without question, and emails from Lisa detailing dream weddings that mirrored her current obsession, but dated back to previous engagements that fizzled amid mounting bills, all of it weaving a narrative of chronic indulgence masked as milestones, where my role as the steady provider enabled their cycles without ever prompting reflection on the toll it exacted from my own stability, especially now when Alex's recovery demanded every ounce of my focus to monitor his energy levels and adhere to the cardiologist's strict regimen of medications and light activities that promised a return to normalcy if only the shadows of betrayal didn't loom so large. Alex's growing awareness of my distraction added a poignant layer of dilemma, catching me one afternoon as I pored over a particularly damning thread of messages from 5 years prior where Evelyn solicited funds for a medical procedure that turned out to be cosmetic tweaks funded by casino winnings she'd gambled away shortly after. His young face furrowed with concern from the doorway as he asked why I seemed more tired than usual even on days off from the insurance office, attributing it perhaps to the lingering effects of his surgery stress, but probing gently about whether Grandma's calls were upsetting me again like during his last hospital stay, forcing me to weave a half-truth about work deadlines piling up in the claims department where denials for procedures hit too close to home these days, hugging him close to mask the guilt churning inside because explaining the full extent of familial greed would shatter the innocence he still held toward relatives who'd sent get-well cards post-op but skipped the fight altogether, and in that embrace, the conflict intensified, weighing the urge to shield him completely against the necessity of arming myself with knowledge to prevent their schemes from eroding the college fund I'd painstakingly built through skipped vacations and side gigs, a fund now flickering with vulnerability under the assault of those persistent bank alerts that continued to detail probes into ancillary accounts tied to old family trusts. The deeper I delved, the more the twist of Evelyn's hidden addiction crystallized. Not just casual flings with slots during retiree outings, but a compulsive spiral evident in archived news clippings I'd printed from local Florida papers about senior gambling rings preying on fixed incomes. Her name subtly linked in community forums complaining of bounced checks at bingo halls and poker nights that explained the erratic patterns in our shared financial history, from the time she claimed a burst pipe necessitated an emergency wire that instead covered blackjack losses, to more recent dips coinciding with Lisa's engagement announcements that served as perfect distractions for bailouts, a revelation that humanized her desperation in a twisted way but fueled my resolve against the light vulgarity of her manipulations, treating maternal bonds like leverage in a high-stakes game where I was the perpetual mark. And the humor emerged bitterly as I imagined her at the tables, clutching chips while mentally tallying how much daughterly support she could extract next. A farce that underscored the impending revenge I enacted by contacting the estate lawyer who'd handled Dad's will, citing irregularities in the trust distributions to initiate a full freeze on the remaining shared account Evelyn administered. The process unfolding with clinical efficiency as confirmations arrived via email detailing locked access and audit trails that would expose any further tampering. A witty maneuver that bypassed direct confrontation while ensuring their wedding facade cracked under the weight of legitimate scrutiny, satisfaction blooming as alerts shifted from attempts to outright denials that I pictured eliciting frantic calls among them. Yet the atmosphere of uncertainty thickened with every passing hour, dilemmas multiplying as Rita followed up with more gleaned intel from family whispers about Mark's involvement in shady property flips using wedding proceeds as collateral, tempting me to loop her in fully on the gambling angle, but holding back lest it fracture alliances prematurely, and Alex's offhand comment during dinner about looking forward to seeing cousins at the holidays if the wedding invite included us stirred a fresh wave of internal debate, wondering if partial truths might inoculate him against future hurts or if silence preserved the fragile peace we cherished. The constant hum of conflict manifesting in sleepless nights where I cross-checked digital footprints leading to offshore payment gateways disguised as bridal registries, building toward a crescendo of revelations that hinted at broader fraud. The cliffhanger struck hardest when a detailed forensic report from the bank's fraud team landed in my inbox unbidden, prompted by the volume of activity, outlining not just the failed incursions, but successful microtransfers from overlooked joint assets directly tied to my post-divorce settlements. Some siphoned subtly over months to vendors linked to the wedding, but originating from funds earmarked for Alex's long-term care. Evidence that their desperation had pierced my innermost defenses and now demanded a confrontation teetering on the edge of irreversible fallout. Leaving me staring at the figures in the dim light of my bedroom, the weight of impending exposure and the question of how to wield it without losing myself in the process pressing down heavier than any medical verdict I'd ever faced. Staring at that forensic report from the bank's fraud team felt like holding a live wire in the dead of night. The stark lines of siphoned transactions illuminating a betrayal so intimate it seared through the last threads of loyalty I'd clung to amid the chaos of Alex's surgery and our tentative recovery. Detailing how over the past year small increments from my post-divorce assets had been rerouted through intermediary accounts to pay for wedding deposits and Evelyn's casino markers amounts. That added up to thousands pilfered under the guise of family unity while they skipped the hospital vigil that defined my world, and with the evidence now irrefutable in black and white PDFs timestamped and verified, I knew avoidance was no longer an option. The constant uncertainty that had shadowed my days evolving into a resolute push toward confrontation that balanced the scales without descending into the same manipulative depths they'd plumbed, yet dilemmas swirled as I considered the fallout on Alex, who deserved a future untainted by this mess, or even on Lisa, whose tearful confessions and voicemails hinted at coercion rather than complicity. Choices that might paint me as unforgiving in the eyes of outsiders who couldn't grasp the depth of abandonment I'd endured alone in that waiting room, prompting a humor-tinged resolve to approach the reckoning with wit sharp enough to cut but not destroy. Because if they treated me like a disposable resource, I'd respond by turning their grand event into a mirror reflecting their own greed back at them in humiliating clarity. The setup unfolded over the next few days with calculated precision. Rita proving an invaluable sounding board as I shared redacted portions of the report during a hushed phone call, where she gasped at the audacity tying Mark's property flips to the diversions. Her outrage mirroring mine and solidifying our pact to attend the pre-wedding brunch at a neutral Omaha cafe as a Trojan horse for exposure, a venue chosen for its proximity to home and the casual setting that belied the storm brewing, and in the interim I layered on micro-revenges with subtle efficiency, forwarding anonymized tips to the Denver venue's management about irregular payment sources flagged in public records, watching online as their social media updates stuttered with delays attributed to administrative holds, and alerting the credit agencies to monitor patterns linked to Evelyn's social security number, each action a witty deflection that slowed their momentum without direct fingerprints, satisfaction derived from the imagined frustration as their plans frayed like cheap lace on Lisa's gown, while the light vulgarity of their predicament elicited a private chuckle at how they'd reduced family to a heist crew fumbling the getaway. Emotions peaked as the brunch day arrived with a deceptive spring warmth cutting through the Nebraska chill, Alex safely occupied at a friend's house with promises of updates to keep him blissfully ignorant, and I arrived early to the cafe's sunlit patio where the scent of fresh pastries masked the tension coiling in my gut, positioning myself at a corner table with the report printed and folded in my purse like a concealed weapon. heart racing with the moral quandary of unleashing truths that could shatter Lisa's illusions or force Evelyn into a corner where denial crumbled into admission. Choices that viewers might decry as too harsh given the blood ties, but which felt like justice after years of one-sided sacrifice. And as they trickled in, Evelyn first with her designer scarf fluttering like a flag of false elegance, Mark striding in with briefcase in hand, as if this were a business negotiation. And Lisa last in a sundress that screamed bridal optimism. The air thickened with forced pleasantries about weather and Alex's health. Their probes for my softened stance met with non-committal smiles that hid the storm, until Rita joined seamlessly, her presence a subtle reinforcement that tipped the dynamic toward accountability. The confrontation ignited midway through the meal when I slid the report across the table under the guise of napkin adjustments, its pages fanning out to reveal highlighted transfers and IP logs that linked their devices to the thefts. My voice steady as I laid out the timeline from surgery abandonment to wedding scams, describing how Evelyn's gambling spirals had initiated the chain with desperate loans disguised as event costs, Mark's real estate sleight of hand funneling the funds through shell vendors, and Lisa's role as the sympathetic front drawing in unwitting relatives with invites that doubled as IOUs. Their faces cycling through denial to dawning horror as Rita corroborated with screenshots from family chats exposing bounce checks and offshore hints. Witty barbs slipping from my lips like how the wedding cake must be layered with IOUs since the icing was all borrowed frosting, eliciting a choked laugh from Rita. Amid the stunned silence, but the truth surfaced ambiguously as Evelyn broke first with sobs admitting the addiction's grip after Dad's death left her adrift in retirement boredom. Mark deflecting blame to market pressures, but conceding the flips had soured, necessitating the diversions, and Lisa whispering that the groom was a convenient cover for bailing them out. Her eyes pleading for understanding that tugged at my resolve yet couldn't erase the hospital emptiness, leaving me to counter with an offer of real help, therapy referrals, and debt counseling paid from my own strained resources, but only after full restitution and a clean break from the schemes. A final revenge that tied loose ends by freezing remaining trusts and notifying authorities of potential fraud without pressing charges myself. The satisfaction profound in watching their facades crack as the venue canceled via a group text mid-meal. Guests pulling RSVPs in the ensuing whisper network. As the brunch dissolved into awkward departures with Evelyn clutching my arm in a last-ditch hug that felt more like grasping at straws, Mark muttering promises of change that rang hollow as his past pitches, and Lisa slipping away with a nod that held unspoken regrets. I drove home through the familiar streets with a hollow victory settling in, the ambiguity lingering like fog over the Platte River, because while the immediate threats receded, questions persisted about whether Lisa's marriage would salvage into something genuine or dissolve under the exposed lies, if Evelyn could truly reform without hitting absolute bottom, and Mark slink back with reformed intentions or fresh cons in a few years. Dilemmas that made my choices feel both empowering and isolating as I weighed the cost of severed ties against the peace of boundaries finally enforced. Arriving to scoop Alex from his playdate where his grin at my return washed away some shadows, but not the deeper wonder if true family could emerge from such ruins. Or if I doomed us to a self-made solitude, leaving the ending open to reflection on forgiveness's price and the shadows that family casts long after the lights go out.